Okay, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. On behalf of the PHRC commissioners, senior management, and staff, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today for another informative and compelling PHRC Diversity Speaks program. My name is Laura Argenbright, and I'm the Director of Communications for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We're honored to welcome as our distinguished speaker this afternoon, Dr. Daniel Jurman, whom Stacy will introduce in a few minutes. Dr. Jurman will be speaking on the impact of DEI in turbulent times. First, I'll cover a few housekeeping items, as we always do. We ask that you remain on mute throughout the program. If time allows, there'll be a few moments for questions at the end of the presentation. This session is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. So just that everyone is aware, we're all in the same Zoom room, which is why it's extra important that you remain on mute and that you're aware of your on-screen presence throughout the program. One last piece, we'd like to thank our interpreters and closed captioners from DHI. Today's closed captions are being provided by Brooke, and our ASL interpreters are Cassandra and Shante. Now, to start the program, it's my pleasure to introduce PHRC's Executive Director, Chad Dion Lassiter. Chad is a national expert and voice on race relations. In addition to many humanitarian endeavors, he founded Black Men at Penn School of Social Work, Inc. at the University of Pennsylvania, where he also earned 2 master's degrees. In 2021, Executive Director Lassiter was honored as a recipient of the Pennsylvania Social Worker of the Year Award, given by the National Association of Social Workers Pennsylvania chapter. Most recently, E.D. Lassiter was named to the City and State 2022 Power of Diversity Black 100 list. E.D. Lassiter, would you please provide a few opening remarks?
Thank you so much, Laura. Greetings and good afternoon to everyone. We want to just thank everyone for being here. This is our second event today. We had a 1 o'clock event, which was the kickoff of our Women's History Month event featuring Juju Chang from ABC Nightline News. And there may be some people who say, well, why did you follow that up with another event on the same day? Well, justice calls us to do that. Laura and Stacy and myself, as the primary organizers of these events, we don't sit around and simply try to do things from a perspective of what people's creature comforts are. And so when you even think about the title today, the impact of DEI in turbulent times, I'm here as a student of humanity, excited to learn. And before we get started, I just want to say that I had an opportunity to meet Dan at the height of a global and historic pandemic, at the height of a budget deficit in the billions of dollars from the state perspective, and also at the height of the killing of George Floyd. Governor Wolf brought together great minds, great souls, great spirits, great people who had expertise in multiple ways of just really looking at how we can galvanize around some of the challenges that were in our state. And I had an opportunity to learn from this individual that you're going to hear from tonight. And he's very modest, but behind the scenes, one of my best friends was former Secretary of Correction, John Wetzel. He and Secretary Newsom and I would have sidebar conversations like, yo, did you hear what Dan said? Did you see Dan's presentation? And so I'm humbled and honored. You heard Laura read my bio, but for me, I'm just a servant leader. And so I'm humbled and honored. I'm going to be sitting here taking notes. And once again, just want to thank our interpreters, want to thank Stacy publicly, want to thank Laura publicly for, capturing the vision of what we're trying to do at the PHRC. Want to thank those senior managers who were on. Wanda Hunter was on earlier, so we're happy to have her back. And I know that people will be joining us on other means like Facebook. And for those who weren't able to join us, that's okay too. Those who are here, we're going to have to put on our metaphoric seatbelts and get ready for what Dr. Dan Jurman is getting ready to bring. And so once again, Dan, thank you for your friendship during those turbulent times on the state level. And thank you for agreeing to be our keynote today. And so we're really looking forward to hearing from you, taking notes and becoming better human beings in the work that we do at PHRC, because we would have spent some time with you in your presentation. So once again, thank you. And thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Chad. That context really does help to put it all in perspective. So now let's get into the highlight of the afternoon. One of two educational outreach coordinators for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, Stacy Waters, will introduce our keynote speaker and will lead the Q&A session at the end of the program. Stacy, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Laura. Dan got to start working with at-risk youth in places like Camden, Newark, and Atlantic City, all in New Jersey, over 30 years ago. He has a bachelor's degree from Rowan University and master's and doctoral degrees from Lancaster Theological Seminary. His career has included working with people with intellectual disabilities, providing healthcare at rural and urban federally qualified health centers, and doing community organizing and anti-poverty work. In December 2019, Dan began serving as the first executive director of Governor Wolf's new Office of Advocacy and Reform, where his focus is to create better outcomes for all people whose circumstances have made them vulnerable. He left that role in February 2022 to return to nonprofit leadership. In addition to his volunteer roles in the community, Dr. Jurman is also an adjunct professor, guest lecturer at the Penn State Hershey Department of Public Health Sciences, and was an adjunct professor at Lancaster Theological Seminary, where he co-taught a course on the intersection between theology and poverty. I'd like to introduce to you all Dr. Daniel Jurman.
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you, Chad and Laura and Adrian. It's good to be with you all tonight. I will try to live up to that, Chad. That was quite an introduction as well, and I will do my best. Really humbled to be speaking to you all tonight about the impact that DEI work can and should have during turbulent times, and in so many ways, I think is the answer to so much of what we've been seeing, honestly, for my entire lifetime. But we've seen an exclamation point on so many issues that were broken before the pandemic that became much worse and continue to grow worse since the pandemic. So I'm going to share my screen, if you'll give me just a moment, and we'll get this started. Let's see, there we go. And I'll reduce a bit here so I can see. There we are. All right. So I'll start with a quote. Outliers is one of those books that that comes to mind a lot. And I love the quote, "Who we are cannot be separated from where we're from." And so with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about what that means to me. And so I'll often do talks about poverty, and I'll start with this case study. Latino, born illegitimate to a 16-year-old single mother, born in a family with no college graduates, grew up in a home plagued by substance abuse and domestic violence, homeless for 6 months, received welfare, food stamps, and Medicaid, multiple drug dealers and addicts in his family. How does this story turn out? And I'll do this with groups like, I live in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania currently, and so I'll do this with groups like Leadership Lancaster, or with other groups with the United Way, to try and teach people a little bit more about the context of poverty and the trauma and the chronic stress that people living in poverty experience. And, and I'll get answers sometimes like, he's a drug dealer himself, he's dead, he's in prison. The answer to this particular case study is that I'm with you tonight. That's how it's turned out so far, and hopefully there's more to come. And that I got my doctorate just last year in the midst of the pandemic. I started before the pandemic, and like so many of you who are listening, tried to kind of hold on with both hands to whatever was normal, and I could still accomplish while the pandemic was going on. And so was pleased to get my doctorate last year. I don't tell this story at any of these trainings or tonight to brag on myself or to make people think that I'm special in some way. In fact, I tell this story because what tends to happen is we see a person and we think of what their story might be, or we hear a story and we picture the person. And so often when we do that, we're wrong. We don't actually capture who that person is. I also tell this story because stories like mine are often used as a weapon against other people who are struggling in poverty, of other people, people of color who are struggling with all sorts of barriers and circumstances. And you know, there'll be that attitude that, well, that person got out, so why don't you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get out as well? And it's not that simple. And in fact, I often talk to people about how lucky I got and how many things had to go right for me to be able to escape the systems that I was in as a young man. That's my mom. As I said in that case study, she was 16 when she got pregnant with me. I turned 17 shortly after I was born. And you can see on the picture on the left there is right around the time that she had me. I think that was her senior year photo. That's my dad in the front with the hat. That's his brother, who was actually, I found out, a professional wrestler for a while in Mexico. My dad wasn't in my life, but has always been in my thoughts. And I was lucky enough to find him due to a program through the Lancaster County Community Foundation back in 2018. Now, he had passed away, unfortunately, in 1999. But through my search, I was actually able to find a half brother and connect to family members that I'd never met before. So the guy on the left is the same as the guy on the right, but a little different. The guy on the left experienced some stuff that the guy on the right doesn't have to deal with. The guy on the left used to get pulled over every now and again in his neighborhood and asked for ID while walking. Used to get pulled over once he was old enough to drive and have his car searched from the glove box all the way through to the trunk. And once asked an officer in North Carolina why he'd been stopped, and in addition to being called boy, was asked if he wanted to spend the night in jail, just for asking the question of why he was pulled over while his car was being searched. That doesn't happen to the guy on the right. The guy on the right's hair fell out. He doesn't work outside anymore in construction with the rest of his family members. He went to college, he works under fluorescent lights. And when he gets pulled over, it's usually because he deserves it. And he's usually called sir by the officer that pulls him over, not boy. But that perspective, that strange journey of kind of being undercover within white privilege now, after spending 30 years of my life being treated a certain way, and now the last 21 years being treated a different way, is a perspective that I bring with me. Like that quote says, I can't separate myself from where I'm from or from the people that I survived great traumas with and struggles with. And that perspective comes with me into the work that I do. And that's true for all of us. Whatever we've experienced, wherever we're from, we bring that into the work that we do. Our intersectional identities and our lived experiences, that where we're from, follow us into every single role that we play and every single table that we sit at and that we have the privilege to sit at. And when those tables allow us to set policy or to make decisions that affect other people's lives, it is incredibly important that we have people with lived experiences, diverse experiences, and worldviews sitting around the table to think about what those policies and practices should be. That history, who I am, that living in between two different ethnicities, those two different experiences of being treated as a young man of color and then being treated as a white man in my older years, came with me into doing the work of writing the trauma-informed PA plan for Governor Wolf in my previous position. And that meant that there were certain things I wanted to do, including making sure that I pulled community members from lots of different perspectives and lots of different worldviews and people who had been survivors of lots of different trauma into the process of advising what went into that plan. And so we reached out immediately in January of 2020 openly for people to apply to be a part of the think tank that we created to help write the plan. And it was very important to me that we had people of different ethnicities and people from different socioeconomic strata and people from different geographies around Pennsylvania, and not just the usual suspects, but folks who were doing this work out in the community. And we had people who had survived everything from child abuse and sexual assault to a school shooting survivor as a part of that work, helping to inform how this plan was written and how it would impact those very communities. So when we talk about trauma, important to understand the definition. And trauma results from an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. That part there, experienced by an individual, is really important, because what it says is you can't decide what's traumatic for me, and I can't decide what's traumatic for you. It's how we each experience it that decides whether or not it has a serious impact on our behavioral and even our physical health. These events can include those directly experienced by the person, as well as witnessing events that are threatening to other people. And so, domestic violence was something I saw in my own household growing up with my stepfather and my mother. And, so witnessing someone else that you care about being endangered can also be a traumatic event. Now, the extent to which that trauma has an impact on you that's harmful and harmful in the long term, especially, really depends on the resilience that you've built up over time. If you haven't built up that kind of resilience, then it can actually create biologically based responses. And those responses can have really negative impacts on everything from your relationships, your ability to function in society, your mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And it's, again, really important to recognize that not all individuals will experience a potentially traumatic event in the same way. An individual's action or reaction to the event can influence its effect on their functioning and well-being. So we all in this room might suddenly witness something very traumatic together right now, and we would all potentially have very different responses to it. And for those of us for whom that event might be triggering or connect back to something that we've experienced in the past, we might find ourselves being really traumatized by something that everybody else in the room sees as maybe not as big a deal. And that's really important to understand as we think about trauma and what it does. Another definition I want to give you tonight before we really dig into this work is chronic stress. And chronic stress isn't that stress like, I was packing today to get ready to move. So, that stressful day packing, or I was in horrible traffic and it was stressful. Chronic stress is kind of this unrelenting stress that just won't go away. And it can negatively affect our health if it goes untreated or it doesn't go away within a certain period of time. And so it can be caused by everyday pressures that won't go away, or it could be a traumatic situation. And the big one here that we've all been talking about for a little too long, unfortunately, is this pandemic. COVID-19 has been a chronic stressor, and such a powerful chronic stressor that it has led to other stressors and other traumas that we'll talk about tonight. Untreated chronic stress and trauma can negatively impact your behavioral health, your physical health, your relationship with your partner, your relationship with your children, your performance at work, and even just your basic ability to just enjoy your life. It can just suck the joy out of your day-to-day life. And so really important to understand the impacts of this. And I want to talk a little bit about the functionality of it. And I will bring it back into the conversation around our DEI work and systemic racism and some of the things that are going on alongside that pandemic. Some signs of chronic stress are irritability, and including extreme irritability, fatigue, headaches, difficulty concentrating or an inability to concentrate, rapid or disorganized thoughts, difficulty sleeping, digestive problems, changes in appetite, feeling helpless. Obviously, if you get something like the pandemic and it feels like you're not in control of anything in your own life anymore. A perceived loss of control, low self-esteem, loss of sexual desire, nervousness, and frequent infections or illnesses, because your system gets worn down by these chronic stresses over time. When these chronic stresses happen to children, by the way, during their periods of brain development, we call them toxic stresses. The only difference between chronic stress and toxic stress is when it's happening to you. And so it can be especially impactful if you're experiencing these things while your brain is in key developmental stages. So think about everything that kids have experienced in these last 2+ years, kids whose brains are developing, and we're potentially in for some real trouble because of the impacts and potential long-term impacts of that much stress for our children every day. These impacts are profound. And so, here on the left, you see a healthy brain, and on the right, you can see the brain of somebody who's experienced abuse. And I want to explain kind of what's happening here. In the healthy brain, the frontal lobe and the temporal lobes are lit up. And that's where the frontal lobe is where executive functioning happens. So our ability to make decisions, solve problems, emotional regulation, that's all up in that frontal lobe. And the temporal lobe, that's memory and language, things that we need to succeed. And so here you can see for the person who's been abused, their frontal lobe is much dimmer than the healthy brain, and the temporal lobes in some spots are completely black. So imagine this person trying to succeed at work, or this is a child trying to succeed in school, and the parts of the brain that they need to do well, those are the parts of the brain that aren't functioning. What is lit up in that abused brain is the brainstem, and that's where our fight, flight, or freeze response lives. And so when our brain becomes accustomed to a danger happening over and over again, a part of the brain that was designed to protect us from, say, like a wild animal attack and pump out adrenaline and cortisol to help us fight or run away from that animal. When the abuse and the danger is something that happens over and over again, that brainstem becomes hypersensitized to it. And so it starts seeing signs of danger even when there isn't danger there. So a child who's being abused at home might hear a teacher raise their voice at them at school, and suddenly the brainstem is saying you're in danger, even though a rational person would say, well, no, they're not. This is a teacher, and you're in the classroom. There are other people here. The brainstem doesn't know that. And so that child is suddenly flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and their body is kind of amped up on these chemicals that are designed to help them fight or run. When I hear about the question, why was that person running or resisting arrest if they didn't do anything wrong? Trauma explains very clearly what's happening for someone, especially someone who has had similar traumas in the past, or who has seen police brutality throughout their lifetime. Their brainstem is telling them, screaming at them, you are in danger. And it's pumping out actual chemicals to help them fight or run. So the gentleman who was shot and killed in the Wendy's parking lot, and they showed that he was fine answering questions until the police put their hands on him. And then suddenly he was resisting arrest. I would be willing to bet real money that if there was a profile done of his childhood, you would find some kind of abuses there and chronic stresses, and certainly past frightening run-ins with law enforcement. I myself, after the situations that I explained to you, which were nowhere near as dangerous as some of the things that we've seen happening to African-American men and men of color in recent years, the past decade, especially as we started to capture more of these things on phones and other things that we've seen, we know this has been going on longer than that. But I myself was in a truancy meeting, and an officer walked in who I knew well, friendly guy, good guy. But as soon as I saw his uniform, I could feel my pulse rate change. My brainstem was telling me that this guy represented danger because that uniform triggered that function within my body. And so I felt my pulse rate change. I felt myself become anxious. And it was this automatic response. And understanding trauma, I knew what was happening inside my body, and I could kind of breathe through it to get to a different place. But this is not a conscious thought. These things are happening within the brain at an unconscious level. You can, through awareness and therapy and other tools, start to get to a place where you can reverse that response, but you can't necessarily stop the response from happening at this point with what science has been able to do. Here's another similar scan between a healthy brain and a brain from someone who's experienced chronic stress. And so chronic stress, we don't often think of as having the same impacts as abuse. But here you can see the same things are happening. It's not as good a scan. I apologize for the quality, but you can see that the frontal lobe is much dimmer. The temporal lobes are black in many areas, and that brainstem again is red hot. So really, it's important to understand that the brain treats chronic stress, things like scarcity, not having enough to eat, and different abuses and dangers in similar ways. And so when I was a kid, we used to say sticks and stones can break your bones, but names will never hurt you. That's not true. And in fact, according to your brainstem, something that stresses you out all the time, like bullying or being discriminated against, that your brainstem doesn't know the difference between that and being physically abused. Its response is still a danger response, no matter which one of those you're experiencing. And that's why this is so crucial, because these impacts can have lifelong impacts on all of us when we've experienced these things and our brain has responded to them over and over and over again. And again, now all of our adults and all of our children have been immersed in stressors for over 2 years now, on top of whatever they were experiencing as stressors or traumas pre-pandemic. One of the best ways I've ever heard this process described is this idea of snakes and sticks. And so you're thinking back to me and that truancy officer, and that kind of automatic response that my body had after years of having some negative run-ins with police officers as a younger man. Matthew S. Bennett, in his book Connecting Paradigms, describes walking along and seeing what you think is a stick. And then when you get up to it, it turns out to be a poisonous snake and it attacks you. The next time you're walking along and you see a stick, your brainstem is not going to wait for your rational mind to say, hey, that's just a stick. It's okay. Your brainstem is going to jump in and start pumping out adrenaline and cortisol just in case, to protect you. Now, if it's just that once and done and it never happens again, you're probably never going to have that same response over time. But now imagine that every other time you're walking along and you think you see a stick, it turns out to be a poisonous snake and attacks you over and over and over again. After a while, your brainstem not only starts to activate when you see sticks, it'll activate depending on what the temperature of the day usually is. The leaves that are around the stick could trigger that. The smell in the air could trigger that. Your brainstem starts looking for any patterns that might be indicative of an attack coming, of a danger coming. And so it becomes hypersensitive. And that's not good for us in terms of trying to get through normal, polite society. And so we become, again, hypersensitized and easy to trigger. Now, here's the thing: as we look at this through the lens of systemic racism and DEI work, and trying to level the playing field in our institutions and our organizations, and it comes to the concept of historical, cultural, and racial trauma. And so I've already defined trauma for you in chronic stress. Historical, cultural, and racial traumas are collective traumas affecting generations and groups with shared identity. And they can have a cumulative effect on an individual and generations in a family or a group. So the impacts of slavery, murder, and racism among African Americans, the impacts of massacres and forced removal from their homelands on indigenous peoples, the impacts of the Holocaust, historical and current anti-Semitism and hatred on the Jewish people, and the impact of the AIDS epidemic, homophobia, and hatred on the LGBTQ plus community. Historical, cultural, and racial trauma are related. And when present, they amplify the impact of additional traumatic experiences. So events like removing children from their homes may trigger reminders of trauma in an individual's family, community, or racial history. And that's really important when we think about the disproportionate impact that our programs and that, for instance, the child welfare system or the juvenile justice system have on children and families of color. And really important here as we think about historical trauma, and this is why I'm digging into brain scans and doing all this other stuff with you tonight, all this heavy work. Historical trauma isn't just historical, it's not memory. That exists too. Our families telling us stories about things that happened. We know what happened to our parents, our grandparents, and back through our ancestry, but it's also biological. And so science has allowed us to see these brain scans, but it's also allowed us to understand that in addition to that neurobiology, trauma rewrites our RNA. And so our brain patterns, that sort of reaction to those different triggers that our brainstem has, we can pass that on to our children and our grandchildren. It's called epigenetics. And so you don't have to have experienced that trauma to still have that trigger. You can actually inherit that. And as men, we can pass that on to one generation, and women can pass that on to two generations because of when a woman's eggs are formed, when she is still in utero. So a grandmother's trauma can actually be passed along, and those triggers can be inherited through those kind of neural pathways that form by the grandchild. So when we talk about racism, when we talk about disproportionate impact of the programs that we administer, it's not just the people in the room right now that we're harming when we get it wrong. It's their children, it's their grandchildren. We are creating harm for multiple generations when we don't get this right. And so, really important to recognize just how deep that impact is. And then we've got everything that's happening right now, and Chad talked about it at the beginning, but COVID-19 has upended everything. We've just had all this fear, and it's really easy now to look at what we know now and kind of superimpose that on how we felt in March of 2020. We didn't know anything in March of 2020 except that people were getting sick and dying, and that it was much worse than the flu. And so as we're looking at that, now we look at it through these glasses, but back then it was all fear as we're, how soon can I handle my mail? We're washing groceries when we bring them home, all this different stuff because we just didn't know how it spread and we didn't know much about it. And we didn't have any vaccines, right? So it's all scary. Political unrest, January 6th, and what's happening with voting rights and voting access right now in this country, the dismantling of democracy. Those are drivers of chronic stress and fear, and they're having an interplay with the pandemic. In some ways, the pandemic has made these other things, much hotter issues. Systemic racism, what happened to George Floyd wasn't new by any stretch. Systemic racism goes back to before there was an America. There were slaves coming here. Puerto Rico, my ancestors' homeland, was a mix of colonizers and indigenous people and the slaves that the colonizers brought over when they took the island from the indigenous people. So these systems have been there. Murder through the system has been there for a long time. But George Floyd, we saw play out on video. We watched it in a way that we didn't watch Trayvon Martin, which was outrageous enough. So we got to see this. We had to reckon with this because it was in front of us. We're at war. We're not at war, but the world is on the brink of war as we watch what's happening in the Ukraine right now. And with Russia attacking and wondering if that's the end of it, shades of the 1930s, all of that stress as Putin is threatening nuclear war. It takes me back to my youth in the 1980s and the constant fear of the Cold War with Russia. Here we are again. And then there's a cascade of trauma symptoms that come out of all this that have all gotten worse since 2020. And anyone who understands trauma and what happens to our brains when we're in the midst of trauma wasn't surprised to see homicides hitting record numbers, especially in some of our urban areas where people are right on top of each other all the time. Overdose deaths hitting record numbers. Child abuse deaths being up by over 30% in 2020. Violent extremism on the rise. We are all people swimming in a sea of trauma and stress. And so, these issues have exacerbated everything that was broken in our systems before then. I also want to point out that this is everyone. And so there are plenty of people that would resonate with what I just said, and there are also people who wouldn't. And so let me just say that if you think COVID-19 was a hoax, if you think that the political unrest is because you think President Biden dismantled democracy and stole the election, if you think that systemic racism doesn't exist and it's actually white men who are being set upon right now and white people, if you think this war is not a big deal and it's being blown up by the mainstream media, and if you look at those homicides and overdoses and you think, well, that's those people and they're ruining society, you're still swimming in chronic stress. You're not stressed out for the same reasons I am about these issues, but you're still experiencing chronic stress. Your brainstem is still doing all that work to try and get you through what you're feeling right now. So this is all of us, whether we recognize it or not, and whether we agree with each other about what is stressful and what isn't, or why something is stressful. And so that's really dangerous when you have an entire populace all swimming in these kinds of traumas and stressors at the same time, because none of us have our frontal lobes and our temporal lobes acting as well and as efficiently as they could and should be, especially when we need them the most. The really important piece of this is, again, when our children are impacted by these things, we call that adverse childhood experiences. There was a study done back in the 1990s by Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control. And what they found was that there were 10 adverse childhood experiences that if you had experienced multiple numbers of those in your childhood, your chances of having really negative physical and behavioral health outcomes as an adult went up exponentially, to the point that where if you've had 6 or more adverse childhood experiences, and you can see the list here on the left of the conventional ACEs that goes from physical abuse all the way down to physical neglect. If you had 6 or more of those, your life expectancy is 20 years less on average compared to somebody who's had none of those. Everything from heart disease, stroke, to cancers, and not just cancers from behaviors like smoking, but cancers that have nothing to do with behavior. Higher instances for people who've had larger numbers of adverse childhood experiences. Philadelphia said, hey, that original study, it actually was about obesity, and it was at Kaiser Permanente, where the patients who were part of the study were mostly middle and upper middle class white people. And so Philadelphia in 2012 did their own ACEs study on an urban, much more diverse population. And what they found was for certain ACEs, much higher instances in the general population than in that original Kaiser Permanente study. So they saw these ACEs that were much worse for these marginalized populations and minoritized populations. And then they expanded and actually looked at some other things outside of those original 10 ACEs. And so they looked at witnessing violence just in your community. So seeing gang activity or something horrible happen in your community, feeling discriminated against. So actually experiencing racism is an adverse childhood experience, and it affects your brain the same way that any of these other things would, as you think back to those brain scans I shared. Living in an unsafe neighborhood, experiencing bullying, and living in foster care or some kind of residential care setting. So when we as a state are trying to help someone, we're actually creating an adverse childhood experience. And in some cases that might not be avoidable, but boy, we should be trying to avoid that in every way that we can now that Philadelphia has done this work. Because what it tells us is that anybody who's experiencing discrimination and unsafe neighborhoods and bullying and witnessing violence in their community and living in foster care or residential care, they're much more likely to have horrible physical and behavioral health outcomes as adults. And so prevention should be where we're focusing. Here you can see, looking at adverse childhood experiences, the proportion of a problem that can be linked back to an adverse childhood experience. This is from work that the Centers for Disease Control did. So experiencing a lot of these can be tracked back to adverse childhood experiences, including drug use as we talk about an opioid crisis. IV drug abuse, 78% of that can be traced back to, and it's half of all drug use can be traced back to adverse childhood experiences. And again, remember that some of those poverty and discrimination-based issues are also playing into that. Also, on the flip side of that, the Department of Homeland Security recently released a study that showed that 63% of white supremacists experienced 4 or more ACEs by age 18. 63%. I haven't seen a study that talks about gang activity. When I was working in Tampa in the past, a lot of my work was anti-gang work and working on having positive outlets for youth, especially juvenile justice involved youth. And I would be willing to bet that it's got to be similar in youth who get involved with gang activity and get themselves stuck in the juvenile justice system, that there are high numbers of ACEs there. The truth is, we know hurt people, and healed people heal people. We need healed people on our teams thinking about what our responses are to all of these different traumas and stressors that we've experienced in the last 2 years, and the traumas and stressors that have been with us since the founding of this country and before. We need the people who have survived and healed from those experiences sitting at the tables of power and decision-making to help us figure out how to move forward in a way that's different. Because the systems that got us here are not the systems that are going to get us to a better place. These crises that we've talked about tonight, they land the hardest on the people who don't have a seat at the tables of leadership, the people who've experienced barriers, who've been shut out of those tables for generations, for hundreds of years. That's who is hit the hardest by these things that we've talked about. We saw it in the pandemic. We've seen it in any of those issues, the homicides issues, the opioid issues. We're often seeing people who are people of color and people of low economic status who are hit the hardest. DEI is the beginning of the reversal of that phenomenon. That's how we start to chip away and build new systems, is by having different perspectives at the table to come up with different solutions and different ways of doing this work and of being together. But that's also why there's such a concerted effort now to tarnish this work. And I think it's really important to call that out as we talk about the importance of DEI in the times that we're living in. So we saw Glenn Youngkin run for governor in Virginia, playing into all of these fears and stressors and traumas that certain populations in his base have, and equating CRT, which isn't being taught in any public school anywhere in the United States. It's not in anybody's curriculum. That CRT is equal to things like social emotional learning, which is exactly how we help kids build resilience when they're to help them work against these traumas and stressors that they feel in their lives. That CRT is equal to any kind of DEI work. And when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we're somehow victimizing other people, people who are white, people who are privileged, that this is all the work of the radical left, or I've heard several commercials now that we're in political season about the woke mob. Dave White's commercial has played quite a bit here in Lancaster, where he shows, starts off his commercial with a little white girl, and the narrator says, "This child is a racist." And then he goes on to talk about how this is what CRT is, and this is what the radical left is doing in our schools. So we not only have all of these stressors and everyone feeling all of these different side effects of trauma and chronic stress, but we have people trying to capitalize on that fear, on that trauma for their own political gain, for their own power. And to me, that's abhorrent. And we have to be aware of it because what's happening is going to tarnish the work that we're all trying to do around diversity, equity, and inclusion at a time when we need diversity, equity, and inclusion more than ever. Again, as they talk about this being something that people on the left are making up, it's important to recognize that our systems fall the hardest on children of color. And so we know that disproportionately, especially Black male children, find themselves much more likely to be in congregate care through children and youth or child welfare intervention. And that's, even when we see similar cases, and there have been states that have taken racial and ethnic identifiers off of cases and found their disproportionality drop. As soon as the case managers don't know the ethnicity of the family, they come up with different and more just answers for how they're going to respond to things. And so we know that bias is playing into this and the impact that this has on Black and brown families. I was part of the Pennsylvania's Juvenile Justice Task Force work, and there you can see some of the data that we saw showing that, again, especially young Black boys find themselves disproportionately put in residential placements, keeping in mind that the Philadelphia study showed that that is an adverse childhood experience in and of itself, that we've seen Black and brown boys disproportionately put into residential settings for offenses that are the same as their white peers who are not being put into residential placements for those same facilities. Those white peers are not being separated from their parents for the same exact offenses. And this isn't just about ethnicity. When we talk about the injustices that we see, one of the other things we learned through the Juvenile Justice Task Force work was that 18% of all youth in PA's juvenile justice system are there because their parents couldn't afford to pay fines and fees. That means that we've essentially set up a debtor's prison for children. Nearly 1 in 5 children in the juvenile justice system is there because their parents couldn't afford to just pay the fine and move on. That is abhorrent. And so we're traumatizing children, especially children who are below the poverty line and children who are Black and brown, as opposed to finding better ways to do the work and more equitable ways to do the work. And I would argue, as I will argue throughout the rest of tonight, that the way to do that is to make sure that the people who are being disproportionately impacted, people from those populations, are sitting in seats of power and making decisions about what our policies are and what our policies aren't. That becomes crucial to getting a different outcome. When we have a case manager walk into a family, into a household, and take their child away, I don't doubt that they are, at least on the surface, thinking to themselves that they are helping that child. But the truth is, if you think about everything else that I talked about tonight, they're creating a trauma for that child that is an adverse childhood experience, and they are triggering a historic trauma, a communal trauma, a racial trauma for that family, for those parents and other relatives. We have been taking Black and brown children away from their families since the founding of this country and before. And we have inherited those traumas from our parents and grandparents, whether we consciously know it or not. And so these events are damaging people in more ways than one. And so again, those people who are most impacted have got to be the ones setting policy. They have got to be the ones helping to decide how we are going to move forward with things like child welfare and the juvenile justice system. We've got to lean into DEI. And not in spite of everything else that's going on in the world, but really because it's really the only way we're going to mitigate the impact of all of these stressors and traumas. People of diverse experiences, ethnicities, gender identities, religions, socioeconomic status, and intersectional identities have to be sitting at the tables of power and setting policy and practice. That's diversity. But we also have to ensure that people who have been historically barred from those tables don't just have equal access. And we say, well, we made it equal for everybody. But they also have to have the additional supports to both overcome systemic barriers that are there to them getting to that table, and also to help them catch up from historical deficits to people not sitting at that table for too long. It's not enough to just paint around the edges. We have to create real equity, not equality. And then once people are at those tables of power, people who bring diversity to that room can have to not be silenced or devalued or just tolerated to be there, or checking the box to say, look how diverse we are, or asked to conform to some oppressive way of being, but are instead valued and honored precisely because of the strength and the vision that their unique perspectives bring to the decision-making process, and that's inclusion. These three pieces are so necessary for us to not just mitigate the damage that's been done by these last 2 years, but to reimagine the broken systems that allowed those things to happen in the first place, that allowed the pandemic to impact communities of color in much more devastating and deadly ways than they did other communities, that allow for gun violence to be something that we see so starkly in our urban communities. DEI and a different way of decision making, I think, is crucial to getting a different result. Diverse, equitable, and inclusive teams make better decisions based on the collective wisdom that they bring to each challenge. Decisions aren't just made in a bubble. I think I'm a fairly smart guy. I've enjoyed running nonprofit organizations. I've handled a lot of crises as a CEO and an executive director. But my single perspective is not the way to solve serious problems. I need to surround myself as a decision maker with people with completely different perspectives than mine or than each other's, so that we're making sure in that decision-making room that we're thinking about the impacts of our decisions on all the people that will experience the other side of that. I can't do that by myself. I've never been a single mom. I need somebody who has been a single mom sitting on my team. I've never experienced certain things that I need that perspective in the room. More importantly, those teams carry the wisdom and perspective of the places they're from. If you think back to that earlier quote, we can't separate ourselves from where we're from. They bring those wisdoms with them, and consider how those decisions are going to impact those places and the people from those places. Good. There we go. So I think it's important that because diverse, equitable, and inclusive teams are how we're going to heal the damage of the past. We have to acknowledge it. We have to own it. And I know there are people that want us to stop us from talking about what's happened in the past, but we have to. You can't heal from something if you pretend it never happened. And you can't heal from something if it's still happening to you. And so we have to also lean on those teams to heal us from the things that are happening to us in the present. And we have to make dramatic paradigm shifts to prevent and heal trauma and the damage of chronic stress for everyone, including the people who we don't agree with and whose behavior we find abhorrent, recognizing that they're acting from a place of being traumatized themselves helps to humanize the situation instead of demonize people. We have to try and heal and prevent trauma for everyone, or we are going to pay the price in cascading waves of new traumas. When you think about those white supremacists and 63% of them having high adverse childhood experience scores, it's crucial that we prevent this from happening to everyone, to prevent the traumas that come out of that for others. I was at a place at the beginning of the pandemic where I said many, many times that the pandemic has shown us everything that is broken in all of our systems, especially systems that impact vulnerable people, marginalized people, minoritized people. And shame on us if we don't fix those systems or throw them out and replace them with better systems as a result of this. My fear is that as this pandemic comes to an end, we're going to rush to get back to normal. And what that's going to mean is the status quo. And we'll go right back to the broken systems that were comfortable instead of taking the risks of building new systems together. But I think that if we have people who represent diverse perspectives sitting around the table, that will be unacceptable. And so DEI becomes crucial to our ability to reimagine a future where Black and brown populations are not disproportionately impacted by every negative thing that happens in society. If we're in a storm of chronic stress and trauma, then diverse, equitable, and inclusive teams represent a lighthouse that leads to safer harbors for all of us. And so I'll end tonight going back to my seminary roots, and I apologize. And my faith tradition has been a Christian one, and so that's the one I know the best. And so the story of the prodigal son comes to mind for me every time I talk about equity. And there are people who resent the idea of equity. A good friend of mine, who's a woman of color, was just sharing with me that she was speaking about equity at a public event. And a wealthy white woman came up to her afterwards and said, I disagree with your definition of equity. And my friend called up the actual definition of equity on her phone and said, it's just the definition of equity. And she said, well, then I disagree with it. She said, I don't think we should just be giving people things. And that just struck me as I heard her say that. It reminded me of that prodigal son story all over again. And if you don't know the story, a father has two sons, and one of the sons asks for his inheritance early, and he goes and wastes it. He goes drinking and partying, and he spends all the money, and then a famine hits, and he finds himself so desperate that he's working and laboring and eating what pigs will eat just to have something to eat. And when the father finds out, he welcomes him home, and not only brings him back home, but throws a party and has a feast and does all these things. And the other son says, that's not right. It's not right. I've been here with you the whole time, and I don't get this party. And the father says, well, you had me the whole time. You've always had me. You've had every benefit of being here. And your brother who was lost is found again. But now tell the story of the prodigal son. And imagine that instead of being irresponsible and wasting all of his money, that somebody else took it from him. Imagine that somebody else took it and made it impossible for him to succeed and forced him to eat with the pigs. It is even more important in that circumstance that we do what is equitable, that we do the extra, that we do for those who have not had the blessing of having it all and having access to it all, that we do for them more to make sure that they can have equality. And that is why that piece is so important as we live in this time where the inequities just keep getting worse and the marginalized keep getting more and more marginalized. Our work within DEI is more important than maybe it has ever been to keep us from moving to the brink of essentially wiping people out through our school to prison pipeline, through inadequate health care. It is life and death that we make better decisions for everyone. And so with that, I will thank you, and I will turn it over to Stacy for Q&A. And stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. That was very powerful. I've heard the story of the prodigal son, ironically in church, and I appreciate it. I did not hear the little twist that the spin you put on it, and I love that, because you talked about people who aren't being wasteful, who've been marginalized. I think we have a lot of people in the room, so to speak, who acknowledge that these are challenges and they acknowledge what the needs are. But how do you get people to buy in who don't have that same awareness or acceptance? How do you get people to embrace? Because I think that's where the challenges are going to be.
Yeah, I have two principles that have served me well so far. One is that you start with the willing. I can't reach out to somebody whose heart is so hardened that they don't want to hear it. And so, I start with trying to build coalitions of the willing and doing wonderful things together to show other people what's possible. The other thing that I cling to is the power of relationship to change hardened hearts. When my mother was expecting me, she came from a white working class family. My grandfather was a carpenter. My grandfather was also very racist. And so he refused to come to the hospital when she gave birth. And when my grandmother called to tell him I was born, his first question was, "What color is it?" Now, I should tell you that by the time he died, when I was 36, my grandfather was my greatest champion. He didn't stop all of his racist beliefs, But by being in relationship with someone who was different than him and learning to love me, it changed his heart to some extent. I think that if we demonize each other, then we get into our corners and we just do damage to each other. And so I think relationship is the key. Now, that doesn't mean I'm the right person or the right ambassador to start that relationship with some folks. Somebody else has to do that. But I think that's the key. I was struck at the Department of Homeland Security. I went to a training and they shared the story of the young man who killed Heather Heyer in Charlottesville with his car.
Mm-hmm.
It turns out that when he was a small boy, his father was killed by a car. And when he was a teenager, his mother was in a car accident that left her paralyzed. And then here was this man doing the same thing to other people that had happened to him. Because so often when we're traumatized, we play it out again, but we try to play it out in a way where we're in control this time and we're not the one getting hurt. But he did hurt himself, and he killed a young woman, and he hurt other people. And so these cycles of trauma, they get these feedback loops that feed into each other. And I think the only thing that can stop those feedback loops is love and relationship. As hard as that can be when somebody hates you just for being who you are and who you were born to be.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in and say, I think it's easy for us to reach consensus that this was a amazing and phenomenal presentation. And I think the question that Stacy raises is a pertinent question. I would like to tackle it a little bit, just in a kind of borrowing from what Dan said. I'm a seminary dropout, so let me just say that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a seminary dropout. But while you were speaking, I sent Laura, Adrian, and Sam a text message of the story of Gideon. And Gideon was asked to go into battle against the Mennonites. And Gideon found every reason to reduce the identity that he had by simply saying, I'm the least of those in my father's house. And Gideon was called into battle, and there's a hermeneutic matters of interpretation, but the story is Gideon goes into battle with 10,000 soldiers, but before the battle, they go to the ocean. And Gideon is told by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those who will lap with you at the sea will be the ones that you go into battle with. And there were only 300 who lapped into the water. And there you get Gideon 300. I think when we're doing civil rights, human relations work, I'm told by my mentor, Dr. Palmer, civil rights leader in the city of Philadelphia and in the country, don't worry about the numbers, worry about the workers. And so that's why when Laura said E.D. Lassiter, and I still think, Stacy, great question. When Laura said E.D. Lassiter, should we get started? Yes, 5 o'clock, right? There are going to be people who will go into battle, right? Our chief counsel, Stacy, our director of communications, our director of policy and governmental affairs. There's always been a small remnant. You know, when you took over the office that the governor created, it was you and 2-3 other people, right? And you can have enterprises, entities, organizations that have a lot of people, but it's always just a small fraction of people doing the work. I did want to comment on the notion of trauma. One of the reasons why I believe God called me to be a social worker is because in my community of North Philadelphia, I would see white social workers, nothing against them, coming into the community and taking children out of the home. You know this, Dan. Adrian knows this. You know this, Stacy. Sam knows this, and just people of color on this call. We know that if there was a problem, and all of us on this call, white, right, on every side of the color line, gender line, if there was a problem, you were wayward, you had behavioral issues before people started talking about the DSM-4, oppositional defiant disorder, they would send you to a family member. And social workers started coming in and saying, no, we're taking you out of the home. Now you're languishing in this child welfare system. And then that trauma of seeing that parent say, no, give me back my child. or the aspect of fathers not being encouraged to be in the home because of the welfare state. Some of the stuff that Jonathan Kozol ended up writing, Maggie and Her Children. And so you just took me back, and you ended up taking me back to that calling. And I didn't, I had it buried into the subconscious. And I just wanted to thank you publicly, because that's one of the things I was able to see: poverty. I was able to see crack cocaine. I was able to see drunkenness, lewdness, but I also saw hardworking middle-class people. I saw grandmothers who would tell you, go to the store for Miss Mamie, or go to the store for Miss Winnie Austin, and you dare not take any money from her. You do it because that's what you're supposed to do. And so social work became that thing that it was like, how can we help people heal, right? Because when our great uncles were sitting in the rocking chair talking to themselves, we would ask our grandmother, yo, who Uncle Pete talking to? Oh, he just talking to the Lord. He was schizophrenic. So he might have been talking to the Lord, but it was some other stuff he was, and so we didn't know what it was. And so you're right when you talk about, the trauma is generational. And Dr. Joy DeCrue Leary talks about a post-traumatic slave syndrome disorder, and how the post-traumatic slave syndrome disorder is generational trauma. And people say, well, what does that have to do with anything? And I'll be honest, and I'll end on this note. I found myself over the past 20 years, at different times, someone would say, how was work? Man, just another day on the plantation. Because subconsciously, work was always seen as undesirable. And so here you are, looking at it, right? The defacing of property. I'm not giving a pass for that, but the defacing of property. Working, and you know him, Dan, working with Dr. Howard Stevenson out of University of Penn. I would always say, hey, Doc, why are these young males grabbing their private parts? And so there was a correlation of generational trauma against the backdrop of castration and the racial trauma of castration. And I was just like, oh, wow. The posting up on the wall, I don't care about this property. I'm going to deface it. I'm going to graffiti it, right? And so I think these traumas, and so that's why I think it's very important for people of color to get out of the space of the taboo of counseling. I see a lot of that in the Black church. My pastor will say, you don't need to go lay on a sofa. First of all, that's a misnomer. You're not laying on a sofa. And if you got a problem, just take it to Jesus. Well, you can pray, but I'm not a proponent of medication. But if you're bipolar, you may need Depakote to level yourself off, right? Just like if you're diabetic, you may need some stuff. And so I just want to thank you. I know we have other comments, questions, and answers, but I just want to thank you, because these things spark change in me. And I think sometimes when we're doing the work, sometimes we're not reminded oftentimes, because we compartmentalize. And you know this as therapists, we can hide our trauma. We can hide our trauma very nuanced and very sophisticatedly. And then it's moments like this where you're faced with, wow, that's what Dan is talking about. And it becomes the shared lived experience, primary and secondary. So I honor you. Love you, brother, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I see two questions, and one is, there's a comment, this validates her work, and that's from Dr. Princess. Thank you, Dr. Princess. She also wanted to know, how do you deal with people who are basically there with a hidden agenda and really are there to be saboteurs?
Yeah, well, I guess I should say it's not that different for me as a CEO. If I'm running an organization and I see those people working within the organization, I think that it's really important within your organization to define culture very clearly, and to define that culture as diverse, inclusive, equitable, and to put all your other values on the table, and make it very clear that people who do not live those values cannot work in that organization. There is nothing that will lose you good people faster than keeping saboteurs and toxic people around and just acting like there's nothing you can do about it. When you define your culture and you're very clear about it, then you can also define what can get somebody fired. you can define what can get somebody a performance improvement plan. HR professionals get scared once you start talking about DEI. Once you start talking about that as a part of, well, this person can't say this, or you can't hire for diversity. They get really scared about that. I had somebody, an HR person once say to me, because I said, look, if I have two people of equal skill, I'm going to hire the person who brings a new perspective to my team every time. I'm going to hire the person who brings some new diversity to the team. And they said, well, you can't do that. That's not legal. And I said, what are you talking about? We've been doing that for centuries. It just goes the other way. When you have two people of equal skill, the white manager is often hiring the person that makes them feel the most comfortable, who they have the most in common with. It felt really good in the interview. It felt like you synced up. Well, that's because you're from the same place and you have the same perspective. That might be great for who you're going to play golf with, but that's not great for who you're going to solve problems with. If you're going to solve problems together, then you need those people who have those different perspectives. And so when you bring that culture together, when you make it really clear, then you can say goodbye to those saboteurs. And then in my personal life, I also say goodbye to saboteurs. I don't have the time for it. I'm getting older. I can't change people, not at their fundamental core. And so when someone is fundamentally, opposed to those principles that I hold most dear, I can be with somebody who disagrees with me on tax policy. I can hang out with people that disagree with me on the size of government. I can't be with people who disagree with my right to exist as a person of mixed ethnicity. That's a line, I can't cross. And I've had that challenge where I've had to say to boards of directors that I've worked for. As I remember after Charlottesville, me saying to my board, I need to be vocal about this. This impacts a lot of the people that work at this organization, and we can't be silent in these moments about people's right to exist as who they are. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. I try to get rid of saboteurs within organizations. There's no value to keeping them around. It's toxic.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions.
Dr. Daniel, ¿cómo estás? It's Adrian. How are you?
I'm doing well, sir. It is so good to see you.
Same here, man. I really don't have a question. I think your presentation was outstanding, and the linkage that you made, and it did harken back to the days where we were working together in eviction prevention and doing all that good work. And I credit a lot of my experiences in Lancaster County and how I look at the enforcement that we do here at the PHRC through that trauma-informed lens. And so one of the things that you were talking about today is all that trauma that people go through is important. And I try to say that to our investigators, like, ask how this has affected their relationship, ask where they're living, how they're eating, because even though that might not be something that you can calculate, these are things you can come back and show an impact for every single case that has to do with discrimination or an unlawful eviction. So, and a lot of that came from my exposure, obviously, to you and your work and your organization's work in the past, as well as all the other partners. So I just wanted to publicly thank you for your influence on that, and thank you again for being present and your time here today.
Thank you, Adrian. And I saw it looked like Dr. Princess had a follow-up question about what if you can't replace, if you don't have the people to replace them. I actually have an answer to that. And it comes from, again, in my time at Community Action Partnership in Lancaster. So we work really hard on culture. I think culture is what people do when the boss isn't looking, for good or for ill. If you build a powerful culture, people will do powerful things without being told to. And if you build a toxic culture, people will do toxic things every time you're not looking. And so we work really hard on culture. We work really hard on diversity, on equity and inclusion. And what we found was we would get rid of toxic people. We would find a way to get them out of our organization. And I was transparent. My first speech to the organization, I said, you can be toxic and you can dislike people living in poverty and you can dislike people of color, but you can't do it here. Go make widgets, like go somewhere where you can do something where that won't matter, but it matters here. And then I had people kind of challenge that and see if they could get away with it, and they didn't. What happened over time is people started showing up at interviews, and we'd ask, like, they'd be great people that we admired who were working at other nonprofits, and we weren't trying to steal people, but people would show up and we would say, hey, like, you're doing great work where you are. What brought you in to interview with us? And they would say, your culture. I was at such and such talking to one of your employees, and she was talking about the culture and how much she loved working there and how valued she felt. And I wanted to work in a place like that. And so I feel like, and I don't want to sound like Field of Dreams, you know, if you build it, they will come. But if you build a solid, positive culture, a culture that makes you feel, you know, as Chad was saying, you don't want to feel like you're on the plantation. You want to feel like you go to work and you do something that matters and that you matter doing it. And if you can feel that, and every day can feel like that kind of rewarding experience, that's where you find the people to replace the toxic culture. Some of them will find you, but you've got to commit to it. You've got to be brave. I've let toxic people go who were clearly racist, who were clearly toxic, but they had a law degree. So my predecessor hadn't fired them, even though they'd had the same toxic behavior for a decade or more in some of these people's cases. It doesn't matter to me whether you got 3 law degrees. If you're toxic, you got to go. You want to sue me, then you're going to sue me. I'll settle with your attorney, and it'll be worth every dime to not have your toxic energy in my organization anymore.
I don't think people realize that, you know, in the long term, having diversity is going to advance, you know, your bottom line. And I think people think of it as all just monetary. That's part of it, but it's not. And I'm just going to segue into a question from Miss Wanda Hunter. Wanda, are you comfortable unmuting?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Now, I belong to the Carlisle Human Relations Commission. We're relatively new in the borough of Carlisle. And one of the things that came up in one of our meetings, how we address the issue of being woke. Is there I won't say a short definition, but just a definition that will cover that term? Like I say, this was posed at one of our recent meetings.
Yeah, I think, so I don't work for the governor anymore. Does that mean I can say whatever I want now? So I'll say I think conservatives are really good at twisting positive things into negative things. They're really good at messaging. And when you start talking about things like diversity and equity and inclusion, it requires some explanation to talk about what you're talking about. But saying that you're calling a little white girl a racist is really easy, and it fits on a bumper sticker and it gets people riled up. And apparently it can even get you elected if you do it enough. For me, and this is just for me, woke started as being a kind of awake to the systemic failures, to the systemic racism that exists, that's existed, you know, since the founding of this country, but before. You know, so my ancestry is the complicated ancestry of colonizers, indigenous people, and African slaves, as is everyone who's from Puerto Rico. There's no separating those 3 complicated ancestries from each other. Being awake to the complexity of that, recognizing how messed up that is, and trying to figure out how to reconcile that and do good in the future. You know, woke was a good thing. Now, do I think that some folks have taken it too far? And you know, and now we're going to police each other to the point where even your allies, you know, end up getting beat down on social media because they say something that didn't quite align with somebody's mindset. I think that we've got to be kinder to each other. But I also think that conservative folks have been really good at negative messaging around something that was meant as a positive. and can have demonized things and made people afraid of things. And, and so you see the phrase I shared in the PowerPoint, the woke mob. I took that right from the ad of somebody who was running for state Senate, or for Senate. I'm sorry, not state Senate, for the Senate in PA. He talked about the woke mob, and they'll talk about the radical left. So I don't know what's more radical. Thinking that racists are fine people too, or thinking that everybody should have health care, or that everybody should be respected, or that we should acknowledge the things that we've created in our systems that hurt people and do something about them. I don't think that's radical. I think that's justice. I think that's human. So that's a long answer, but I think that woke, just like anything else, can be turned into a cudgel, when it was actually meant to say that we need to wake up and I think recognize what's broken in our systems, and that we have a moral responsibility to fix those systems, for ourselves and for our children.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we want to go ahead and thank Dan once again, thank our interpreters, thank Stacy, and just want to thank Laura, want to thank all the PHRC staff that were able to attend. Thank you for just, lending your spirits at this evening. A lot of us have multiple identities. We're parents, we're with significant others, we have other things, and just want to thank everyone that's here. We have recorded this. We are going to make it available. And Dan, as you venture into this next sojourn of your identity, Chief Counsel Sam Rivera and I were texting one another that children is really where it's at. Nothing about adults, but I kind of harken back to the movie, and I'll let everyone leave on this light note. Will Smith's movie, I Am Legend. It was just him and the dog, love human beings, but children, there's a purity to it. There's an opportunity to structure some things for them that's different. A lot of adults, not generalize the stereotype, and they get set in their ways, and there's opportunities for change for adults as well. But we thank you for this presentation. It's some stuff here in the chat, but it's some stuff here on the phone where we're like, yo, get that thesaurus out, get that dictionary out, really, really high level stuff. And so we honor you and thank you so much. And everyone, have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Yes,
everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jurman. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr.